if you want someone to show up a certain way, which is how your brand is going to be perceived, you need to not only train them on that, measure them on that, and reward them on that. And that's, I think, something that marketers can do in partnership with sales really effectively in B2B companies.
Welcome to How I Made It in Marketing from Marketing Sherpa. We scour pitches from hundreds of creative leaders and uncover specific examples, not just trending ideas or buzzword-laden schmaltz, real-world examples to help you transform yourself as a marketer. Now, here's your host, the Senior Director of Content and Marketing at Marketing Sherpa, Daniel Burstein, to tell you about today's guest.
To me, every customer touchpoint is a thing of value. And yet, some brands will pour millions of dollars into a Super Bowl ad, while at the same time, cutting customer service to the bone. Doesn't make sense. Yes, both ads and customer service and every other touchpoint, those are valuable. So I saw a kindred spirit when I read this lesson in a recent podcast guest application that came across my desk. Brands are built by how you show up every day. Joining me now to share the story behind that lesson, along with many more lesson-filled stories, is Taya Hayden, Interim CMO at Cognizant. Thanks for joining me, Taya.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited about the conversation.
All right, before we jump into it, I want to tell everyone your background so they know who I'm talking to. Taya started early in her career. She was a PR specialist at 3Com. She's been a communications specialist at Global Star, director of marketing communications at Compellent, a senior director of content strategy, campaign planning, and creative at Dell Technologies, many more roles. But for the past 5 years, she's been at Cognizant. Cognizant reported $19.4 billion in revenue in 2023, and Taya manages a team of 350 across brand and digital marketing, global communications, events and sponsorships, field marketing, marketing operations, and technology marketing. So Taya, that is a big portfolio. Give us a sense, what is your day like as interim CMO?
Well, we work across several time zones, which, by the way, are very real in my life. So my day generally starts pretty early. I am a big fan of a morning routine. So I that can be long, that can be short. It depends on how early my first call starts. Sometimes my first call starts at 6 a.m. and I do just a very short morning routine. But after that, I'm off and running. And what I'll say is that every day is a little different, which is what I love about marketing. But the thing that's the same every day is that I'm very focused on communicating, connecting, and collaborating across the organization, which is also what I love about marketing.
I like that. People often talk about every day is different. That's cool. But I like how you've set out the 3 C's, we'll call them, of what you need to do every day. That's nice. Well, let's take a look at some stories from your career. As I mentioned, I've never worked in another career, really. I mean, never been a podiatrist or an actuary or something. I don't know. But I don't think they build things. We build things. We build brands. We build campaigns. It's so exciting. And a key to that, as you mentioned, one of those C's is communication. So you said communication can be hard and it's critical. How did you learn this lesson?
It's funny. People think, especially marketers who are natural born communicators, they think it's easy, but it can be really hard, especially when you're collaborating across teams. And I came across a quote last week. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. And so I was like, wow, that landed with me really deeply. And what I found is that you just have to have frequent and constant communication. And so an example of that is about 4 years ago, we were doing a brand launch and we were working across 4 different external agency partners and an internal digital and social team. So we had an ad agency working on a TV spot. We had a brand agency working on a logo and a new visual ID. We had a comms agency working on earned media. And we had another agency that we had working on all the digital activations. And so you can imagine the intersectionality and the interdependencies of all of that. And it was happening in real time, which is how the magic always happens in marketing. And so one of the things that we instituted, and it's been a practice of mine for a long time, is what I call a daily huddle. Sometimes people call it a stand up. I call it a huddle because I'm not standing up. I'm usually sitting down. But that frequency of communication and collaboration just makes sure that every team shows up and communicates, and every team is across all the change that can happen when you're building and launching a brand at scale.
I appreciate the specificity of the name. Do you keep it to 15 minutes? Because one thing I've heard about, Agile and all of that is the idea of a stand up was people don't want to stand up for that long. And so like it forced a quick meeting. Now I know you mentioned global, we're all remote. Like, do you force a quick time to it, or there's a lot of players there? It could go long.
Yeah, it depends. It depends on the nature and the frequency, and how close you are, right? If you're far out and you're doing big thinking, you can't really do that in 15 minutes. You need to, share more. If it's about status updates, 15 minutes is you're in and you're out. And that
Okay, well, let
works.
me ask. I love this idea of communications. I love that quote too. How do you have a specific example of something you do to make sure the value proposition is understood across your entire vendor ecosystem and internally as well? Because, for example, I interviewed Jasmine Gutman, the head of corporate communications of Content Stack, on How I Made It Marketing. I love one of her lessons was large meetings are not for decisions. Right. And
That's
so
right.
one of the problems we have when we talk about this big vendor ecosystem, especially at a big public company like yours, is two things. One, there's just complexity. They don't work directly for your company. They work for many different companies. Even in your company, right, there's so many people. But then also, in fairness, and I'm not saying this is what's going on at Cognizant, but I've seen this at other brands, sometimes the knives are out, right? Because these different agencies, they're competing for budget and priority. And so you get into a meeting and it becomes more of a, I don't know, United Nations like face off over like a war or something versus let's all work together and build this value proposition. So for you, Taya, is there something you've learned to do to make sure everyone working on the brand is clear on the value proposition, no matter who they technically work for, what company?
Yeah. And it may sound simple, but write it down, and share it and consistently share it and share it repeatedly. Now, before you write it down, of course, there's the process of iteration, and it always is kind of changing. And it's back to that idea of communicating and sharing and collaborating. I do not weaponize information. I think you have to democratize it. And especially when you're working across large teams, you have to be transparent and share that information or no one will succeed. And so I think sharing it verbally and then writing it down and sharing it are some key lessons I've learned.
I love that quote, weaponize information. Because I'll tell you, at one point in my career, I was working with an AT&T spinoff company, and I won't say which one, as an external vendor, as an external consultant. And we were working with people internal to the company, and I was external. And there was someone at the headquarters and not at the headquarters. And she would always keep information to herself. And it's like, well, we're working on this transformation project. And she's like, well, people came out of the meeting. I can't say exactly what was discussed. I can say there was some laughter. I can say there was some anger too and stuff. And so I'm an external vendor and I'm thinking like, this is ridiculous. But the other guy on the call too, he worked at the company just in a different location and he'd be stressing out over it. And I was thinking, I know sometimes legacy AT&T, not picking on them, some of those bigger companies, like, yeah, that was a political thing you would do. You would weaponize information. So I love your idea of, sharing, writing it down. I also want to talk about this next lesson. Always start with the end in mind. Famous Stephen Covey maxim. I'm a big Covey fan. I love that. How did you learn this? How did you internalize this in your career?
Over many, many years, I've internalized it. I think it was something I learned early on. And it's because as marketers, our stakeholders will sometimes come to us and want a thing. They'll come to us with a tactic, like, I want X, Y, or Z. And until you uncover what it is behind the ask, then you won't ever get the out. If you just do what they ask for, half the time it's not going to deliver the outcome that they really wanted. And the outcome is what marketing is all about. So a funny kind of somewhat recent example of this, we had someone about 4 years ago come to us and say, we really need a TikTok channel. We really need a TikTok channel. And so, there's the 5 whys, but I approach the 5 whys from a listening perspective. And I think you have to listen relentlessly, because if your stakeholders feel questioned, they're never going to partner and you're never going to get to the right outcome. So it's a conversation, it's a dialogue. Of course, you're asking why and you're having suggestions around it. Well, after about the 3rd conversation with this ask, we realized what they were really after was increased employee engagement. And the team that they were working with was actually largely in India, where TikTok wasn't even available. And so when we realized that, it was like a big aha, which you have in every marketing project that you work on, and you just wait for it, right? You wait for that aha moment. You're like, I get it. This is what we need to do. And so based on that understanding and the listening, we were able to pivot and say, great, we can use these channels and here's how we can effectively communicate to that audience. And I think when you look at what you're trying to accomplish first, it's so much easier to get there in the end.
I love that. And by the way, for anyone listening, if you don't know the 5 whys, look it up. It is so helpful, not just in your career, but in your life. It comes from TQM, Total Quality Management, manufacturing companies. Toyota famously used it. I love the 5 whys. Let me ask, how do you bring the customer into the conversation? And especially when it comes from not someone that reports to you, but someone that's either kind of a peer or CEO or the board or whoever you're dealing with as a CMO. Because I love what you're saying. When I think sometimes people think they see someone like you, if they're earlier in their career, well, she's CMO. She can just tell people to do whatever they want to do. She doesn't have to ask the 5 whys. She can just kind of use that positional authority. But even many CMOs I interviewed too, right? There are people that they have to deal with, they don't have positional authority for. And it's especially challenging in the C-suite, I think. I know, again, we're very marketing focused for the CMO. I used to work for a manager. He famously said, there's no CEO who's taking a shower in the morning, or very few, and they come and they're like, you know what, I had a great idea for a JavaScript in the morning, or programming or whatever. But everyone thinks they're a marketer, and that extends to the CMO, the CEO, the C-suite, analysts you have to report to as a public company, board members, and all these things. So I won't put you on the spot to mention someone's name, but can you give us a sense of, when someone that you didn't have positional authority came to you with an idea, and how you brought the customer into the room to make sure, to your point, answering the 5 whys, it actually served the customer?
Yeah, absolutely. And marketing has a unique advantage because oftentimes we're doing the research and we understand the customer more than anyone else in the organization. And I think that that's a position of strength. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is the best marketers blend that understanding and that the kind of science and the data and the art of creativity. And so when you can come to someone with in an ambidextrous way, like with whole brain thinking, and say, that's a great idea, and here's what how customers are going to react to it based on this piece of data. And so I found that that's a really effective way to address when you don't have positional authority, which oftentimes you would think you do, but sometimes you don't.
Yeah, no, that's great. The ambidextrous thinking. Yeah, you got to search. If you're not familiar with some of these terms, you got to search a lot of the ones that Taya's saying, because they'll be very helpful for you in your career. Another lesson you mentioned are brands are built by how you show up every day. How did you learn this lesson?
Well, as a young marketer, you think, oh, the brand team, they build the brand, they're responsible for it. And after working on various brands for 20 years, I learned that while the best brand teams and the best campaigns can absolutely positively influence brands are really a relationship. They're about the relationship you have with your customer, and that relationship exists across the entire organization. So it is advertising. It's how you show up in public relations, in media. It's also the person who answers the phone, or the chatbot, right, that answers the phone, or the delivery of the product, or the sales of the product, or the support of this, or the service. And so when you think about it that way, you have to just take a more holistic approach to brand, and thinking about brand unifying a team behind a brand, and unifying a team behind how you measure it. It's not, yes, of course, you're going to do brand monitoring research, and you're going to do qualitative research, and you're going to do maybe some pre-post for a campaign, but you have to also measure, customer satisfaction, signals, social listening. What are people saying about us? NPS, Net Promoter Score. And then you have to synthesize all of that information and use that to help you understand how the brand's being perceived and what you need to do to ensure that they're perceived the way that you want to be perceived.
And I'm glad you mentioned the person that answers the phone, or the chatbot. And I wonder if you have any examples from your career. I know you worked for startups, you worked for big companies, of what you feel like your role in marketing was to get involved with customer service. Because one thing I've noticed is a lot of companies look at, as kind of I mentioned in the open, marketing is where we spend money to have good customer touch points. But customer service is a cost center, and we will cut back to have good customer service. And there was a real aha to me. This was pre-COVID, but I wanted to mention post-COVID too. I was getting a washing machine or something delivered by Home Depot. And I wasn't working at home back then, so I was specifically working at home from, and I was like looking out at the specific time to get it. And I live in a cul-de-sac, and I noticed this big trailer kind of pull around, just this generic trailer to pull around the cul-de-sac to come back my way. And I'm like, well, that's not them. That's not Home Depot. And then sure enough, they get out, and it's just plain white trailer, and these just guys wearing nothing special, and they're installing the Home Depot washer. And I thought, well, I know why that was done, right? Because there was a meeting with the CFO that said we can outsource and save $5 per delivery or whatever. But I was thinking, well, shouldn't the CMO be in the room and say, no, we're entering people's homes. We need to have the Home Depot brand. Now, bringing that into B2B space, of course, just yesterday, actually, and I won't mention the company, our company had a customer service fail with one of our vendors. And I was talking to our CEO, and he said, you know what I've noticed, like post-COVID, man, customer service has just really gone downhill for whatever reason. So I asked that because as you talk about the brand showing up every day, like you mentioned, it's not just in whatever your version of the Super Bowl ad is to everyone listening, right? It is that customer service picking up the phone or tech support or even how you're using that AI bot. So for you, Taya, in your career, have you ever as a marketer like felt like you had to step into that customer service arena too to make sure the brand is showing up correctly?
Yes. And sometimes with different authority and sometimes with different acceptance, I will say. It's not always an easy conversation. But what makes it easy is if you have worked on brand values, right? What does our brand stand for? And you can use those to say, hey, are we really showing up this way? They're like a rubric. Is this how our brand is showing up? Because every touch point is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to grow your brand, to grow your loyalty, or it's an opportunity, a missed opportunity in some cases, like your Home Depot. That's a huge missed opportunity for a
Yeah, I was
brand.
thinking through again. I get the CFO lens. I get the public company. I get that we need to, reduce it for every delivery. But I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this company is coming into your house. What an opportunity, right?
Yeah.
I also want to ask this because it's something I see in B2C and B2B and run it by you. And maybe this doesn't work or whatever. But I wonder too. You mentioned that. I like that you mentioned every day. Is there anything you do to make a B2B brand a habit? And I ask this because we had at a previous marketing Sherpa summit, we had Charles Duhigg speak. He was a super great guy. He was a New York Times reporter, and he wrote a book on habit. And like one of the things he talks about when I interviewed him was famous Claude Hopkins advertising example. People didn't used to brush their teeth. Their teeth were rotting out of their head, I don't know, 100, 200 years ago. And Claude Hopkins came up with the idea of how to make it a habit. And one of the things they do is when you brush, there's that little kind of like tingle you get, which apparently you don't need to clean your teeth. It's used to have that habit and remind you of like remove that film from your teeth. So now today, if we don't brush, it feels wrong, and they've made it a habit. And that's very popular in B2C products. He's using an example with Febreze about adding scent to cleaning products so you know something was cleaned. But I thought too, like B2B products, like every day, I go into my Outlook, I have that habit, right? I go into my Slack, like I have that habit. So from a B2B brand, is there anything from the brands you've worked on, you've done to try to instill it as a habit to kind of pay off, as you said, those brands showing up every day? And maybe you could tell me, nah, it's more of a B2C thing. It never worked for us.
I mean, at the end of the day, brands are, again, that relationship, there's a human. There's a human involved. So it's definitely not just a B2C thing. I think the difference is potentially because it's more of a human interaction and a lot of, high touch relationship sells. It's really about consistency. And consistency can be driven by what's measured and what's rewarded. Right. And so I think if you want someone to show up a certain way, which is how your brand is going to be perceived, you need to not only train them on that, measure them on that, and reward them on that. And that's, I think, something that marketers can do in partnership with sales really effectively in B2B companies.
Okay. So thanks for Taya shared a lot of the things that she learned from some of the things she made, as we talked about, as a key part of marketing. But we also learn lessons from the people we collaborate with, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. But first, I should mention that the How I Made It in Marketing podcast is underwritten by MechLabs AI, the parent company of Marketing Sherpa. You can get conversion-focused training from the lab that helped pioneer the conversion industry in our AI Guild. Grab your free 3-month scholarship to the AI Guild at join.mechlabsai.com. That's join.mechlabsai.com. All right, let's talk about some of these lessons from some of the people you collaborated with. The first person you mentioned was Phil Soren, who is the CEO of an IPO you worked at, a company you worked at that IPO'd and ultimately was acquired by Dell. And you mentioned you learned from him that the best cultures can be both positive and aggressive. So take us into the room where this stuff happened. How did you learn this from Phil?
We actually named the culture and we wrote it down and we called it positive aggressive. And it can seem like a contradiction, right? Either you're positive or you're aggressive. But Phil was able to bring those two things together to drive a bigger impact. And what that looked like was the team would go after it, right? They would get it done and they would kind of always get it done, but they would take the high road and they would bring the rest of the team with them. So not only were we relentlessly focused on the outcome, we were relentlessly focused on the how we got there, right? How we got there. And that really unlocked people's potential to do great work and to work as a team, and it unified the culture. And it was one of the best places I've ever worked. It was a fantastic culture to be a part of.
So you talk about building that culture. I think of, in B2B companies, there's different communities we have. We have that internal community, but so many times external communities are important too, whether it's open source or user groups. And I wonder, do you have any examples of building a culture in an external company? Because, for example, I interviewed Marcus Collins, head of strategy at Wieden & Kennedy, New York, on How I Made It Marketing. And one of his lessons was you don't build community, you facilitate community. And he gave an example of working with Beyonce. So for you, I did a quick search on GitHub for Cognizant NetCentric. It says, we heart open source, right? So I guess, there's open source, that's an important community. User groups are an important community. Marcus's opinion was you don't build, you facilitate. Do you have an example of how you instilled culture into an external community that was important to your brand?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the best examples is client, events that we host, right? And how do you show up? This is an example not only of building community, but building brand. And I think that you can build those in parallel. And in the best cases, your consumers are part of your brand community, right? And so back at Compellent, which is the data storage startup that we were just talking about, we built it was a very technical audience, and we built a user group called C Drive, pun intended, right? Back in the day. And we had people come and just be facilitating that connection between like-minded thinkers and sharing best practices and being able to kind of geek out together. It really not only built a community, but it helped build our brand. In fact, we were one of the fastest growing data storage companies in the world at one point. And I think it was a lot about that culture that we just talked about. It was a lot about that brand, and then taking that brand out into the community and welcoming our clients and customers into that.
And I think a lot of the value there is, the customers can hear from your evangelists all day long. And some brand evangelists are rock stars in industries and helpful.
Yeah.
But boy, when they start getting to know each other and learning from each other and helping each other and hearing from each other, it's a multiplier. And I think of that when I look at your next lesson. You mentioned enthusiasm and optimism can be contagious. And you said you learned this from CMO Bruce Kornfeld. So how did you learn this from Bruce?
Yeah. Bruce would always show up with this fantastic smile on his face before he asked something impossible. And it was also impossible to say no to him. And so it was like, okay, Bruce, I get it. And how are we going to get it done? And even today, my team has threatened to make me a t-shirt that says, yes, and because when they come to me with a challenge or an obstacle, I always acknowledge it with optimism, which I learned from Bruce, and a smile on my face, like, yeah, I get it. That sounds really hard. And what are we going to do about it? And that helps unlock people's kind of like, okay, I didn't ignore the challenge. Like, the challenge is real. It's there. But challenges are to be solved, and marketers are natural problem solvers. And I think that kind of yes and allows you to acknowledge the challenge, build on it, and build on it with optimism. And that really, truly is what allows you to do things that you thought were impossible. And oftentimes, the things Bruce asked for were literally impossible, and we did them.
I love that. But there's a famous quote, I think it's from David Ben Gurion, and said, the difficult we do right away, the impossible takes a little longer. So let me ask you, okay, so now you're leading a big team, you're leading a company. What do you do to empower, especially the newer people on your team, to solve these challenges? Because when you talk about these conversations, when I've had them in my career, yes, I see they tend to be from, not always, but from more junior people in their career, and they'll come to me with a problem. And I remember I interviewed a professor from Queens College before, and I told her, like, hey, for your higher level students, at least, you've got to stop being so specific with the syllabus. You've got to stop telling them what to do, because then they come out into the marketplace, they come out to us, and they look at us. Now we're their professors and their academic advisors, and they say, okay, great, I came to you with the problem. What do I do now? And my experience working in business and marketing has never been, I can follow the syllabus. It's, oh no, the world has just changed. What do we do? And so for you, so to your point, when they would come to me and they'd say the challenge, I'd take a similar approach. Yes. Okay. What do we do? And it would kind of surprise them sometimes, because it's like, wait a minute, I told you the problem. Now fix it. And like, no. We all got to fix it. It's just us. You got to fix it. We got to fix it. So with especially more junior people coming onto your team, they're so important. We need them. They are native to things we will never understand with digital marketing, AI, and all these things. What do you do to balance that of giving them authority and power, and to fix things, to do things, to go out there with, at the same time, of course, brand preservation?
Yeah. I think that's an example where teaching people to collaborate effectively really pays off, because especially if you're young in your career, you don't often have the experience to rely on, right? You haven't gone through whatever experience that you're having right now. And so sometimes, most of the time, I'll be like, oh, wow, well, have you talked to so and so about this, right? Have you connected with this person? Or what about this? And it almost becomes like concepting kind of exercise. Like, oh, what about this? Or what about that? And I think if you just uh, lead with that optimism and encouragement I try not to give people the answers. I really try hard. And that actually is something that I learned. I used to just go in and be like, well, why aren't you doing this? Right. But that takes away people's authority, what they were talking about, and it doesn't empower them to grow and to learn on their own. And so I pivoted about, midstream in my career, and started asking smart questions and encouraging collaboration. And if people don't get there, you can help them along the way. But it's like, have you talked to so and so, or have a conversation about it, because conversations unlock potential.
Yeah, I like that. Serving as a guide and asking questions versus giving the answer. All right, one more lesson here. You say, pay attention to your say-do ratio, and you learn this from Michael Dell. How did you learn this from Mr. Dell himself?
Well, it was he was the first person I heard say it and
Okay.
actually model it, was Michael Dell. And he was like, look, we got it. If we say we're going to do something, we got to do it. And it was kind of a core ethos when I worked at Dell. In fact, one of the leadership sessions, there was a leadership coach that came in and said, this is so important. Stop saying, hey, we should get together, if you don't have any intention of getting together. Don't say, hey, let's grab a coffee, if you're not going to call them or schedule it to get a coffee. That's how important it is that if you say you're going to do something, you actually do it. And that was foundational for me in terms of not only my leadership style, like if people tell me they're going to do something, I expect them to do it, but also my communication style. If I say I'm going to do something, even if it's like, I'll call you later, I absolutely do. And the day doesn't go by without me doing that. And that, I think, is just, it's about being authentic and real, and keeping your promises.
So I love that. One of the things to make the do happen is we actually have to execute, though, right? And so you mentioned you've been in startups and you've been in major brands. You're a big public company now. Do you have any specific examples of how that execution part of something you would do differently or the same in a startup or a big company, right? Because when you talk about Michael Dell, he famously started the company, I think it was in his dorm room, right? He was a startup. of course, now then he led a company, Dell, that was a major public company, right? And the challenges I hear, it's funny, I hear from both sides. From the start, I hear like, oh, it's so hard to get anything done. We don't have any resources like the big companies. Then you talk to the people at the big companies, they're like, oh my gosh, it's so bureaucratic. I can't get anything done here. I wish I worked at a startup, right? It's just all your viewpoint. So I wonder if you have any examples of like, okay, here's startup versus, major public enterprise. Here's things that would do similar or different to actually make sure you come through and get the do done, right? Actually get it done.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. It is easier to execute, to do the thing at a small company, but you don't have the opportunity for impact that you have at a larger company. And you're doing the thing on a bigger stage at a larger company. So it's a little more difficult. It requires a little more pre-wiring, right? And so I would say at startups, you can just be like, okay, you ask one person, is this good? You go, right? At a larger company to execute, you need to make sure that you're doing a lot of stakeholder management. And I think that that's a skill that people early in their career should look to learn, like conceptual awareness. Who does this matter to? Who is this going to impact? And have I talked to them about it? And we use a term called pre-wire. Like you need to have the meeting before the meeting, right? You need, and that's especially at big companies, that's important because you don't want to show up in the room with your stakeholders and have them not have seen what you're about to present or execute. And so some of those relationship things are almost more important. You just have to have more relationships at a bigger company. And that's how you can execute.
Let me ask you too, when it comes to execution in your career, have you done anything differently at a private company versus a public company? Because that's definitely one thing I've heard too, is that kind of different level of scrutiny once you're a public company. You talked about IPO in your previous company or a public company now. Yes, in a private company, you always have investors. It could be private equity, it could be, other private investors. You always have some press attention. But once you're a public company, I mean, there are analysts that are specifically, their job is to know every time you scratch your nose, right? And then you just get a kind of different scrutiny level of press, not to mention the broad array of shareholders you have. You talk about that pre-wiring. I wonder, is there something different you do when you're executing privately versus publicly?
It's the scrutiny, I think, that you have to expect that you mentioned. I think you're spot on. At a private company, you can make decisions without having to consider as many implications, right? At a public company, your decisions have more implications and you just have to consider all of the different stakeholder audiences. And so I think I was actually at Dell when we went private, right? And decisions were made differently when we were a private company. It's easier to transform and make change, I think, faster if you're a private company than if you're a public company. That's been my experience.
Bit of a sigh of relief. So, all right. So we've talked about so many different things from your stories and your experiences of what you've done in marketing. If you had to break it down, Taya, what are the key qualities of an effective marketer?
My favorite marketers are curious. They are listeners. They're learners. And that idea of whole brain thinking, like right brain, left brain, they're able to integrate creative and data and bring those to bear to deliver the best outcome. And I think those are what I would say. And they laugh, like they're lighthearted. The best marketers don't take themselves too seriously.
I love that. I've asked this question many times. We've done over 100 of these. I have not heard the laughing one. That's a great thing. And I love laughing. We'll try to laugh more because of that. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Taya. I learned a lot.
I appreciate it. It was great talking to you.
Thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you for joining us for How I Made It in Marketing with Daniel Burstein. Now that you've gotten inspiration for transforming yourself as a marketer, get some ideas for your next marketing campaign from Marketing Sherpa's extensive library of free case studies at marketingsherpa.com. That's marketingsherpa.com.